So, hey everyone, it's good to be with you this morning again. It's good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us this morning, and especially nice to have my wife, Reverend Linda McDermott, back with us and to be in this conversation with us. We're talking about disruption, parables for the pandemic, and we're in part 3 of looking at how parables disrupt things. But particularly, I just want to clarify, when we're talking about disruption, we're not just talking about an inconvenience or just kind of, something that sort of messes with us a little bit, or an obstacle.
We're talking disrupt.
We're really talking
open.
about something that breaks us open, like we mentioned last week, something that changes the way we see. Richard Rohr put it this way: it's the change that changes everything. It changes how we see everything in relationship.
And that's what these parables do.
They do.
And their intention, again, is not to instruct, but to disrupt.
Yeah.
And so,
so we have one that we're starting with.
We have a parable.
Very disruptive.
It's dumb.
It is dumb. It's kind of dumb. We found this was a difficult one to kind of wrestle with.
Yeah, it was. It's irksome.
It's very illogical.
What was Jesus thinking?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're going to tell us the abbreviated version of this.
Try to abbreviate it because it's a little bit long.
Yeah. It's in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew.
Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20. Okay. So, the kingdom of God is like a landowner who goes out early in the morning and hires workers to go into his vineyard and work. He makes a deal with them that he will pay them a denarian for a full day's work, which is a reasonable wage.
Feed a family for a few days, at least.
It's a good wage. So, that all makes sense. Now, here's what doesn't make sense. The same landowner comes back to the same place he hired the workers 4 more times, 9 in the morning, noon, 3 in the afternoon, 5 in the afternoon, and does the same thing. He hires more workers, go out into the vineyard. Now, when the day is over, he says to his manager, call everybody in, we're going to pay them. So, but, he says, start with the ones I hired last. So the manager does that, and the landowner gives the ones who've worked like an hour a denarian. Now, what do you think the ones hired first are thinking?
Clearly, you'd think the other ones are going to get more.
Well, that's only fair.
They worked all day.
If they worked an hour and got a denarian, and I worked all day, I'm going to get a bonus. So they come up, the landowner pays them a denarian.
All the way down the line.
Everybody gets the same thing.
Yep.
And the ones hired first are not happy.
Yeah.
Because it's not fair.
Yeah.
And the landowner says to them, I didn't cheat you. I did not lie to you. I did not cheat you. I gave you exactly what we bargained for, and it was a fair day's wage. What is it to you? Why does it bother you that I would choose to be generous?
That's how it ends. That's how the parable ends. Yeah. His listeners were not happy with that.
Well, I guess it kind of depends, but it's not fair. And, we value fairness.
So we got to talking about morality, and we got to talking about ethics in this idea of this story, and we had just been listening to this interview.
Unfairness seems like unethical. And immoral.
Right, yeah.
So that's the question.
Yeah, so...
But we listened to this
thing that really kind of kicked us off on thinking about morality in general, and it was an interview with Krista Tippett on Being, and it was Jacqueline Novogratz, who, you can hold the book up. It's a brand new book that just came out. Sounds like we had a product placement. Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, Practices to Build a Better World. Now, this woman has been considered like the top 100 thinkers in the world, innovators, entrepreneurs. She's been a successful financial banker. But now she's been successful for the last couple of decades in doing micro grants to places like Africa and enabling and empowering people in creating all sorts of cottage industries and such. But she had this motivation from listening to a speech shortly after the Berlin Wall fell, and she heard Steve Jobs talking back then in the late 80s and the early 90s. He said, technology and capitalism is going to change the world, right? And she says he was right. It did. It changed the world. And yet, all these years later, these decades later, we still have great disparity, increasing economic disparity, and we have even greater disparity in terms of our emotions and our relationships with one another. We're far more binary, far more divisive, and divided in our
so many
culture.
ways.
And so what she says is this moral revolution is not about doing away with profit, but it's taking profit out of the center of the relationship and putting instead people and creation, people and the earth in the center.
Some kind of a balance there.
It's a different
It's
way,
a way of living
seeing.
in harmony,
So,
even within a capitalistic society.
so what bothered us about this was that this seemed counter. What was it about morality that misses this point? What is it about morality that misses seeing relationships at the center of things, as opposed to profit, or as opposed to sort of a tribalistic orientation? Because morality is oftentimes more tribal than it is relational. You were talking about this.
I mean, Krista Tippett asked the question of what is moral? What is morality? And, you know, for me, for you, think about it. What do you think of when you hear the word morality?
You consider yourself a moral person. I guess most everybody
I
out
would
there.
probably
I consider
venture
you
to
mostly
say
moral.
that
Mostly,
Thank
yeah.
you.
And I haven't stolen anything in at least a couple of years.
that's
So I've been very
progress.
good. I've only yelled a couple of times.
Anyway, back to the point.
Okay.
So morality, you know, for me as a kid, it meant that you didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't steal, and all those don'ts.
Right.
And then when I got into like junior high and high school, it seemed like the definitions of morality were more around sexuality. So we had people with loose morals. We had people who were immoral.
Often more
And-
directed at the women
Exactly.
as well. A whole nother issue of tribalism.
Exactly.
And how, I mean, because in a sense, what we're saying is that morals became a
okay.
way of weaponizing people. We weaponize morals as a way of dividing.
Judging, dividing,
You're
excluding.
in or you're out of this group. And we do it even to this day. The church
And we
still
hurt
struggles with
people.
that.
It really doesn't allow, the moral code isn't very generous.
Yeah, you know, and we need order.
Of
right?
course,
We need
yeah.
order. And
I
I'm
value
Irish.
order.
You're German.
We valued order.
You value order. I value. but so when we were in Germany, I'm just going to sidebar here. When we were in Germany, you remember that we were in Berlin.
I know what you're going to tell.
We were visiting
Don't
with our
pick
kids.
on my heritage.
Our kids were over there. He was studying for his master's, and we were traveling back from being across the border. And as we were coming into a small town in the middle of the night, I was driving, mastered riding on the wrong side of the road. No, we were on the right side of the road. Yeah, but we came to a yield sign, and it was dark.
It was dark and nobody
Still
was
some
on the
lights.
road.
No lights anywhere. The
Nobody.
nearest lights were hundreds of yards down the way of a car
Yeah.
coming down, headlights, hundreds of yards. Yield, pulled out. I think I kind of tapped the brake and kept on going.
Sure, but we could see.
So we're heading out of town, and all of a sudden these lights are flashing behind me, and follows us 10 miles out of town. I'm like, well, okay, I'm pulling
Not 10,
over.
about 2.
Okay, it was about 10 minutes. Anyway.
Felt like 10
It
because
felt
they were
like-
shining.
They were flashing
blinking
their
their
lights, and I pulled over to try to let them go by, and then I came to a stop because they kept slowing down. They came to a stop next to us, rolled down the window, spoke in German. Thankfully, our son fluent in German, and he looked, and then he said, "Dad, just smile and say I'm sorry," and then they'll move on, and that's what we did. And they drove off. I said, "What was the matter?" He said, "Well, technically, you didn't stop at that yield sign for 15 seconds."
I think what he said was, you didn't yield properly.
That's right.
Now, don't pick on my heritage. They, yes, they're very orderly people, and they like it when people stick to the rules.
Well, and it functions well.
It does, and
when
it
people
serves
function,
purpose.
when people follow these rules, it's only when
it
morals
brings order out of chaos.
absolutely morals and rules are great, but it's only when, which is I think what was happening in Jesus' time as well, is when the moral structure becomes a way of excluding.
Yeah.
Of defining one tribe as opposed to another, of excluding people. And it was
exactly.
certainly happening in when Paul was writing the early church, and you had the Gentiles and Jews and different groups mixed. It was always about they're not following these rules that we follow.
Right.
And Paul was saying you don't live by that code anymore.
Look at 1 Corinthians 13. What is love? It's patient. It's
Yeah,
kind. It's
yeah.
the things that bring us together, that bring
It's a whole-
harmony. I mean, you can make rules about love, but it's about the relationship.
So what about this parable?
Yeah,
Doesn't make sense, but is talking about something else entirely. right?
I hope so, because on the surface, you got a couple of things going on. Number one, this vineyard owner, the kingdom of God is like a vineyard owner
It's like the owner, with if you follow it logically,
was stupid,
was stupid.
not a very good business person.
Right. Why is he going out several times during the day?
Doesn't he know how many people he
Yeah.
wants?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one. Okay, the kingdom of God is like a vineyard owner who was unfair.
Unfair. Unjust.
What?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he didn't cheat anyone, but still, I mean, who's going to work when you have things like that going on?
It's not a good business plan. It's
not a good business plan.
It's
You
not
know,
a
when
good business manager.
When I taught this in a class, one person raised their hand and said, you know what's going to happen tomorrow. Nobody's going to show up for that early shift. And it's true. What a stupid business plan. He set a really dumb
I show up about 5 o'clock, maybe 4.
precedent. So,
Yeah.
if that's what he was doing.
But it's not meant to be a logical story, a linear story.
Exactly.
It's meant to shake you up. It's meant
Mm-hmm.
to take familiar terms, images,
was he?
ideas,
What's the idea of fairness or morality or
and then
ethics?
turn it on its ear.
And he does.
Right? I
He
mean,
really does.
because what he says is at the end, what's it to you if I choose to be generous with everyone?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that must have taken everyone by surprise, because their God that they understood was one of sort of legalisms and structure, and at
yeah.
least in terms of
This
their
is
religious
the way to
experience.
please God. This is the way not to, and there may be consequences. But in this case, there was generosity.
Well, so getting back to this idea
Mm-hmm.
of putting people at the center, a relationship, that a relational model,
Which is the basis of shalom.
which is the basis of
which
shalom.
we've been saying repeatedly that the
kingdom-
parables are about what is the kingdom of God like.
These kingdom parables, and what's really interesting too is these parables are about now. They're about here and now,
Right.
and how do we make this happen? The reality is that it's saying that shalom, peace, balance, wholeness is how things work well. Is when we do that in right relationship. So I was I'm reading this book called Prisoners of Our Own Thoughts. Prisoners of Our Thoughts, and it's written by Alex Patakos, and he's this PhD psychologist. His psychology is based on logotherapy, which is
It's Viktor Frankl.
Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist, and many of you are familiar with his book Man's Search for Meaning. And
My dad gave that to me at 14.
Yeah.
Kind of changed my life.
Yeah, so a
it's
Jewish
logotherapy.
psychiatrist who was encamped, imprisoned at Auschwitz during World War II, where so many died. Most of his family were killed, and it's based on this one concept of how we make meaning. But how we make meaning, as he put it, was by choosing. We have the will, we have the freedom to choose how we will respond to the situation we find ourselves in. And he decided to choose to respond out of humanity, out of a humaneness.
I remember one example was that people were of course they're starving, but he had a piece of bread and somebody else didn't, and rather than hide it, he tore it in half and gave it to the other man.
And even if a soldier dropped something, he would pick it up.
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean, he just chose to respond out of an orientation of humaneness, out of humanity, rather than inhumanity. And that gave him meaning. Now, what he wasn't really connecting with at first, and what this book does, Prisoners of Your Own Thoughts, is this idea that Martin Buber, also a theologian, the late 19th century theologian, early 20th century.
I know you really
a philosopher,
liked him.
also Jewish, had this idea that there's two ways in which we relate to people, or we relate to the world. There's basically two ways. And he said one way is it. We see one another, we see others as kind of objects or utilitarian for our purposes. What are we going to get out of the relationship? Or what are we going to get to meet our needs? And so it's a very self-oriented relationship. He said that's pretty typical for how we relate to the world. And I-thou relation.
Even if we're being nice to someone, but our motivation is I need them to like me.
Right. Right.
I mean, yeah.
Even our motivations are sometimes out of a bit of a dysfunctionalism. I mean, but it's still a utilitarian, or
Right.
what some people would
it.
call a transactional relationship, which is the parable is talking about this transactional relationship.
That's what
That
the
does that's what the
owner does with the first one's hired. There's an agreement.
right, but the reality is that's not what the story's about at all.
No,
The story has nothing to do with transaction
because it's not fair.
because it's more of an I-thou orientation,
It
which is we see others and honor them for who they are, for what gifts and what we don't know about them that they bring to the moment, that we open up and we're vulnerable and we're receptive of. So we see relationships more as less as give and take and more as give and receive
and receive and
Right.
accept
and accept.
and
There's
and look.
there's more of a generosity. Elie Wiesel said this once. I think you had this written down. I'm gonna say this. He said, "If you ask me what I want to achieve," Elie Wiesel, who's the Jewish Pulitzer Prize author, he said, "If you ask me what I want to achieve, it is to create an awareness."
Awareness.
And the opposite, he says, of love. This is the awareness that the opposite of love is not hate, but is in fact indifference.
Right.
The opposite of love is indifference. It's that it kind of way of relating to things. Jesus turned that way of seeing things, the change that changes everything. He turned it on its head and said, you have to disregard that entirely. The kingdom of God, the kingdom, the connectionalism,
Right.
the shalom is about right relationship.
Right.
How we find right
And
relationship.
in this parable, right relationship wasn't based on fairness, but it wasn't based on unfairness either.
Well,
like I
yeah,
said.
Yeah.
Nobody was cheated. Nobody was lied to. Everybody was treated ethically. The first ones and the last ones were all given, the first ones were given their deal, what they agreed to. So the awareness is, what else is missing here? Why weren't they able to be happy that these people who couldn't find work all day found a job that enabled them to feed their family that night? I mean, could they really not celebrate that? Had they been cheated, maybe, but they hadn't. They hadn't been.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some people try to soften this parable by saying, well, maybe the people who weren't hired initially were the elderly or the
Right.
sick, and they got bypassed every time. But there's nothing in this parable that implies that. In fact, he says, why are you standing here all day? In other words, you look like you're able-bodied people. Why aren't you working? And they say, nobody hired us.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
it's so easy for us to want to try to make something logical out of these.
Yeah.
And in reality, sometimes these things are meant to shake us up, to disrupt us enough to see something different. And to be honest, a lot of these parables didn't get understood. And to be fair, maybe we don't understand.
Well, there's not one meaning.
You ask 10 scholars to interpret these various parables, you'll come up with 10 different
answers.
different interpretations.
And they're legitimate. That's what it is. It's
They're fluid.
they're supposed to ignite conversation, wrestling, struggling. So
The illogic of
you
them.
could take it in the form of compassion for those who didn't get hired, but there's something else here. To
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
it also really, I've begun to see it as more about generosity than compassion.
So why ultimately does he tell these parables? Why is he telling these parables?
I think for the same reason that Elie Wiesel said that. I think Jesus, as well as Martin Luther King, as well as Gandhi, as well as the Dalai Lama, as well as Desmond Tutu, they've all told these stories that talk about awareness. To be able to see beyond what seems obvious, look beneath the surface. Jesus is raising awareness. Parables confound, confuse, but they also achieve insight. Take off your blinders.
So would it be fair to say these parables are at most or best maybe aspirational? I mean, some would argue that they are simply to stir you up, to disrupt, to get you thinking.
Sure.
Others would say that they do somehow still point to this idea of shalom, almost this idea that that if you can't experience you have to experience the kingdom now. It is opening up to you now.
Yeah, I mean, we're in danger, I think, when we think the kingdom of God is something other than after this. I mean, if we can't figure it out here, if we can't embrace it and begin to experience it right here, what difference does it make?
So they're aspirational. How do we make them pragmatic? How do we achieve them pragmatically?
I mean,
that's the
that's the
challenge.
challenge for each one of us, to start looking with awareness that we are all interconnected and that God calls us to live in shalom and right relation with each other. And so my actions influence other people. I may not see them, it may be very far removed, but it's a conscientious effort to me to make decisions, difficult decisions, like where does my food come from? It might take a little bit of exploring. Where am I purchasing things? From whom? Am I trying to save $1, but I'm investing in bad business practices that are polluting? These are the kinds of decisions we have to make with the understanding that we're all interconnected.
Well, so I'm just a closing couple of thoughts here, because I read something recently that was also looking at this idea of I, thou versus I, it. And somebody who writes a blog post that I tend to follow, and he was saying that right now we're in this very transitional time, this very unknowing kind of time, where it's a little bit insecure. It's uneasy because we don't know when we're going back to work, when should we all go back to worship, and we're working on that as a staff right now, thinking and planning ahead when it's safe. We are definitely working on timelines, but at the same time, there's this anxiety that maybe we're rushing into it. And some of us are wearing masks, and some of us are not wearing masks, and some of us are wearing masks as a way of saying...
What was your friend that said we've divided ourselves into
masks and the mask knots. Yeah. And even that becomes a statement of divisiveness and a moral sort of stance, right? Even that we sort of have a tendency to make it a moral stance. And so my friend, or this person I follow, said instead of making a moral stance, he's decided with this I-thou understanding to see the situation differently. He's going to see everyone as a part of the same reality at just different levels of knowing and unknowing, but he can respond out of this position of being everyone's secret ally, which I think is, so he's going to be wearing this mask, and he says, now I see people without the mask. They're not smiling necessarily, but I've determined I'm their secret ally. I'm here for them. And for the people that are wearing the mask...
work for the benefit of the other.
Regardless. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm here for those who are wearing their mask, but I'm going to imagine they're smiling back because they're secret allies too.
So maybe part of our calling and response and practical response is to see ourselves as an advocate for the other, and a secret ally.
Yeah.
I'm here for you.
I mean, it's a playful thing for sure. But it's an intentionality
it is intentional.
that puts into practice this understanding that we are all interconnected.
And our calling as followers
of Jesus,
we are not
all aware,
is that we need to be intentional about our awareness.
Yeah.
Pay attention. Listen.
Live out of that.
Listen to the stories behind the thing, and live that out as the advocate for the other, advocate for the community, advocate for creation.
What would it mean in a moral revolution, in this idea of moral revolution, to begin to ask questions that are more person-centered in relation to everything than they are profit-centered, for example? And to basically pause long enough to think through what that means and how we live into that connectedness.
We are connected. If anything has really shown this pandemic has done that. We are interconnected. We depend on each other.
So we're going to continue this next week with more parables, looking a little more at what keeps us, what blocks us, what
confounds us,
what we contribute to blocking ourselves in this process. Yeah. But Brad's coming up with a song that speaks to this, and it's going to be beautiful. Sharm's got a wonderful prayer that she's going to give now, and we're so glad that you're joining us and staying with us in this conversation as we sort of think our way through all of this and literally converse our way through this. We hope you'll join us again next week, and hope you have a blessed week. Bless you. Bye-bye.